just kind of getting you to think about what your first interaction was with this map. For me, it was like the first year of like formal schooling. And I remember being given a blank one of these maps, very similar to the one that we've got in front of us right now, and being asked to label the capital cities that went along with the states, and feeling this like huge amount of pressure to get it right. So that was something that I like distinctly remember. I guess I want to flick over to this map and kind of get you to reflect on maybe when the first time it was that you saw this one. Sometimes when we do this, it's today's like years old, like people have actually seen it for the first time today. And I want to, I guess, acknowledge that even though we see the first map first, obviously this second map is 60,000 years older than the first. And today we're going to talk about innovation, education, entrepreneurship, new, all sorts of like cool buzzwords that are very future focused. And I want to just kick off today by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land in which we live, work and play. I'm coming to you from Brisbane, Yagara and Turrbal land, and I'd love for you to drop in the chat what land you're joining us from, because we often have educators joining us from all sorts of places around this country. So if you've got a moment, I'd love for you to just drop into the chat, like, where are you coming to us from? I'd love to know what land you're joining us, which would be cool to see. So yeah, drop that into the chat now and we'll start to sort of amass a bit of an idea about where everybody's coming to us from at the moment, which is kind of cool. Thanks for joining us, Corinne and Jess. Finding yourself just out of lockdown, I think, at the moment, which is always good. But please, yeah, let us know where you're coming to us from right now and sort of drop into that chat what land you're joining us from to sort of get involved and kick us off. I just want to start with a couple of little bits of housekeeping, I guess. So the first one being that if you haven't done so already, just jump into your video settings in the bottom left-hand corner, click on video, click settings, and then just say hide non-video participants, and you'll get sort of this full screen view from your experience today. So I would love for you to do that to kick off. So a little bit about me, I guess, and how I'm joining you today. My name is Nick. I'm the founder of Future Anything and like an educator. So for a long time, I worked in classrooms and I guess came to a realization where I was curious about whether the curriculum that we were designing for young people was the right curriculum. And so I started to ask questions around the sort of learning experiences that we were offering young people in our classrooms. As the eldest of 5 children growing up, I was a very compliant young person. So it was quite curious when I stepped into the classroom and found myself questioning, I guess, the way that we did learning. And so that started quite a journey for me around looking at particularly inquiry-based learning and project-based learning as kind of a platform that we could start to explore curriculum opportunities for young people that were more linked to life. For me, I realized quite quickly that the more we build that connection between the learning in the classroom and the real world in the outside world, we actually really, when we fuse those together, we get engagement out of it. So I'm very curious about how we can use curriculum as a platform to actually connect our young people to the real world. Today, we're going to be talking about entrepreneurial pedagogy, and this is something that's actually quite important to me. And I want to share a little bit about the journey that kicked off Future Anything as a bit of a context to this platform and this pedagogy that we're going to be talking about. A number of years ago when I was working at a school in Brisbane, I was an English teacher, so that was my sort of subject that I taught. And we were about to embark into a Year 9 unit of work. And any English teachers in the room, feel free to raise your hand if you're an English teacher. The unit of work that we were looking to do was actually have young people dive into Indigenous representations in text. And then the task that they needed to complete at the end of that was a monologue. For me, I felt like the unit of work was quite surface level to what young people were tapping into. And so the question for me was, how could we transform this unit of curriculum into something that was a little bit more hands-on and real world? So what we actually did with that piece of curriculum is we used that stimulus, so young people diving into representations of Indigenous people in texts. We use that strong literary base as a platform for young people to start looking at marginalised groups within society. And the question for us was, what were the societal or political or economic or environmental impacts that created some of those marginalised groups that existed within our society? And instead of having the young people kind of pitch back to me what they learnt about the marginalised group, I actually asked them to pitch a social enterprise that closed the gap for a marginalised group of choice. So in this way, they needed to find a connection to a group within our society, a vulnerable group, and then instead of tell me about why they struggled, actually solve part of that problem using design thinking and entrepreneurship to pitch their own social enterprise. Now, from a national curriculum point of view, the young people were embarking on ticking, I guess, all of the boxes that I needed to. They were still deep diving into Indigenous representations in text, and there was still a spoken task at the end. But the way that we got there was actually quite different in the sense that rather than just regurgitating fact, the young people were actually using what they found out as a platform for their own problem-solving journey. So a lot of people look at the work that we do at Future Anything and assume that this entrepreneurship work that we do started in subjects like business or enterprise or STEM. But I think it's really important that we talk about the fact that the program actually started in English. And this story is critical to what we're going to talk about today with entrepreneurial pedagogy, because I guess the first thing that I want to start by saying is that entrepreneurial pedagogy can be woven within any curriculum piece. It doesn't belong in some of our elective students. It doesn't belong solely in elective subjects like business or STEM. It can actually be woven within the fabric of some of our core subjects like maths and English and our humanities subjects in order to actually transform that learning experience from being just absorbing fact and regurgitating it to actually synthesizing that information and almost reshaping it to present it back through assessment tasks that are authentic and connected to the real world. So I guess I wanted to start with that provocation, but I'm kind of going to throw to you a little bit now. And what I want to do is ask you if you could if we're going to spend sort of half an hour together today, 30 minutes of valuable quality time together, if you could get one thing out of today's live learning session, what would it be? And I want you to pop that into the chat. We're going to take 60 seconds, and I'd love for you to have a think about if you could get one thing out of today's live learning session, what would it be? And I want you to drop it into
that I sent you a link to.
If you guys could just make sure that you've got you're muted just for today's session so that we're not sort of listening into everybody's. Cool. Awesome. So we'll jump back into that. We're going to take 60 seconds. I would love for you to have a think about if you could get one thing out of today's session and one thing only, what would it be? What would we unpack today to do with entrepreneurial pedagogy or entrepreneurship programs, or the difference between, or perhaps the future capabilities that underpin that? And just take 50 seconds now and just drop it into the chat. What do you want to know more about? What should we deep dive into today? And let's sort of co-construct this experience together. Cool, thanks for jumping in straight away and Corinne, and talking about a different way of teaching business projects. Great. What else do we want to sort of unpack today? Don't be shy. Any requests are welcome, but just take 20 seconds and think about, what do you want to dive in today? What are you curious about? What would you like to know more about? What's unclear for you that you'd like for us to really unpack? Cool, great comment so far around looking at that K-12 scope, looking at effective ways to integrate entrepreneurial pedagogy into a variety of subjects. Love that. We'll take another couple of seconds if you've got, just to drop some of those requests in there that you might have. So as we're sort of finishing up with those comments, I just want to dive into a little bit of the research around the difference between entrepreneurship education and also that entrepreneurial pedagogy that we're actually tapping into. So I guess what we're talking about here, you'll notice that as I present, there are some QR codes up in the top right-hand corner. Feel free to zap those and it'll link to the research or some more supporting material that actually sort of underpins the stuff that we're discussing today. So the first thing that I want to mention is entrepreneurship education as a piece is where entrepreneurship is the object and the objective of the study. What we actually want to move towards is this notion of entrepreneurial pedagogy, where we're using entrepreneurship as a learning tool. So in this way, we're actually looking at the fact that we don't want young people to necessarily be entrepreneurs out of this. We're actually looking at building the skills and capabilities that underpin thinking like an entrepreneur. Now, when we think about this in any sort of embedding of entrepreneurial pedagogy within our classrooms, we actually need to think about what is the key objective that we'd like to get out of this particular unit of study. So whenever we do unit planning, as you guys know, we're thinking about backward mapping. Okay, so what are the key skills, objectives, knowledge that we want young people to understand at the end of this particular unit of work, and then we can map the learning experiences back from that. There's quite a bit of research around different entrepreneurial outcomes that you can actually shoot for within a piece of curriculum, and you can see listed from here A to H. They're actually very different objectives within a unit of study. So you've got things like looking at obviously the entrepreneurial behaviours, skills and attitudes, all the way through to generic competencies associated with entrepreneurship, the grasp of key business, the nature of relationships and stakeholders, the process of going into business, or even motivating young people towards moving into a career in entrepreneurship. So I guess the first thing that I would say is whenever we're using entrepreneurship as a pedagogy to underpin any piece of curriculum, think about what is the key objective that you'd like to get to at the end, because then we build the curriculum and the learning experiences underneath that in order to achieve that outcome. For us at Future Anything, we're a big believer in that entrepreneurial behaviour, attitude and skill development. In other words, we're looking to actually build our young people to think like entrepreneurs. We're not specifically looking for them to be entrepreneurs. And so in this way, we're actually looking to build a generation of young people that are enterprising, as opposed to building a generation of young people that are entrepreneurs. And there's a very big difference here. And part of this is actually then focusing on this key skills and capabilities that underpin thinking like an entrepreneur, rather than focusing on the outcome at the end, which could be an enterprise. The reality is that not every young person that taps into any sort of entrepreneurial thinking is going to love the idea of being an entrepreneur. So the key component of this is actually the capacity building of the core skills that underpin thinking entrepreneurially. Now, for us, we focus on 5 or 6 key skills in our program, and you can see 5 of those here. The 6th one is also critical thinking, which is another core capability required for young people to navigate the future of work. Now, this is really critical because I know that many of you will have engaged in the literature around the future of work. McKinsey's just released a report that talks about 54 different skills that young people will need to navigate future employment and the job market as it evolves and shifts. But the average 12-year-old today will have 17 different jobs over 5 different careers. Now, why this is very important when we think about where we're moving to is the fact that young people are not moving through education in order to attain one specific job or occupation. The likelihood is that they're going to move through several phases in their working life. And so capability building that can be transferred across key occupations and employment is critical for young people. And looking at these 5 skills, it really doesn't matter which job a young person is going to tap into, or whether they want to be an entrepreneur or not, they're going to need to apply these critical skills. So I just want to leave them, let that sit for a second, because obviously we've got about 20 minutes before we tap into some Q&A. So I actually want to throw to you, if we think about those 5 critical skills and perhaps embedding them in the classroom, which one would you like to dive into a little bit more? So we'll take some sort of requests. If you'd like to know a little bit more about embedding a particular skill or capability in the classroom, like which one do you want to dive into, and we can actually tap into that a little bit more. Whilst we're sort of thinking about that and perhaps what we'd like to jump into, I just want to show you a little bit of the work that we do in order to map these key capabilities. So as I said before, Future Anything actually started in the English classroom. So you can see our driving question for the English program is there. So it's as an entrepreneur, which is the beginning of the question, pitch an innovative idea that closes the gap for a marginalized group of choice. So that's kind of our driving question for our English curriculum. But you can see through our science curriculum and our different business curriculums, we adapt the driving question in order to refocus the young people around a specific problem-solving context. Now, this context is taken directly from the curriculum that it needs to link to, and the science is a great example of that. In our science unit of work, our young people are actually pitching innovative solutions that make the world a safer place from human impact or natural disasters. So in this way, they're actually tapping into the science unit around ecosystems, and like earthquakes and tectonic plates. And from looking at this piece of curriculum as context, they're then taking that in order to solve problems and develop business ideas out of that context. So the reason why I want to show you this is our curriculum units can be these really beautiful catalysts for a problem-solving space, and in which place you can actually drive young people to develop entrepreneurial solutions to the curriculum context that you've used within your subject. The second sort of caveat to this that I would give is it's critical that we actually map these entrepreneurial contexts across our school. Now, this is critical because if we've got young people that are doing an entrepreneurial venture about a school problem in year 7, and then they're also replicating that same context about school in year 8 and year 9 and year 10, we're actually going to get sort of that repetition of the same piece of curriculum for our young people, which is going to get tap out. Now, it won't matter how innovative or interesting that curriculum piece is, if we're actually replicating the same context across multiple year levels, that repetition of context will actually disengage young people from that entrepreneurial venture. So mixing up the context across year levels is actually critical. And I'll talk in a moment a little bit more about how to place context for young people. The next thing that I would say when we're looking at these key capability building across our classrooms is actually trying to develop ways to measure how your young people are progressing within those skills. One of the key concerns, I guess, with building capability in any of these soft skills or 21st century skills is where's the metric for young people to see if they're getting better? Because if we're not placing that element of responsibility on the young person to ascertain how they're traveling and what they can do to improve, then as the teacher, we're holding all of the cards for their improvement. So we need to actually create those, you'll see my dogs occasionally in the background, that's Cody. We need to create really specific junctures within our curriculum in order to pre and post test our young people, and then place that information back in their hands so that they can ascertain how their capability is developing through engagement in stuff like this. So one of the things that we do is we actually pre-test and post-test our students. And then our schools are provided with that comparative data to see how their young people have progressed. Now you can see that the questions that the young people are responding to are down sort of the left-hand side of the page. And then the metrics that they're using to rate their confidence in those key capabilities are across the top. What you can see here is like an example of a percentage point change for a cohort in the program from the beginning to the end of the program. Now, there's some pretty significant shifts in just a 10-week unit of work because our Activate program does run over 10 weeks. If you snap that QR code, it actually links to an article on our Future Anything website that actually has PDF copies of the pre and post survey questions that we use and some of the rubrics that we use for young people to self-mark in these future capabilities. So feel free to jump on there and access that information. But I guess like what I want to impress upon educators is that if we're not providing opportunities for young people to assess their progress in these capabilities, they won't know how to get better. And it's really important that we're using, I guess, data in a way that actually empowers our young people to, I guess, get better in these capabilities in a really productive way. So really trying to think about how we can use data in order to actually inform the development of our young people moving forward. So just flicking back to the conversation, a few requests for adaptive mindset and project management. So we might sort of duck into those ones in particular. Let me just switch PowerPoint so I've got the right one. Cool. So jumping into adaptive mindset, I guess the first thing to point out is that we often flag this one, or the language modeling that we use around this one in particular, is this notion of like failure fitness. So how are we building the capacity of our young people to encounter feedback or encounter failure and use this as fuel to move forward? And the first thing I want to do is show you a picture of this guy. Now, for those that don't know, this is James Dyson, and I'd love to throw to you and ask the question, if any of you were at the BEAQ conference recently, the Business Educators Conference, you'll know the answer to this, so I want you to like sit on your hands and not respond. But I'd love to know, if you know off the top of your head, or if you'd like to have a guess in the chat, how many prototypes of the first vacuum did this entrepreneur do before the Dyson vacuum was released to market? I'd just love for you to have a think about it. How many different iterations of the Dyson vacuum were done? No Googling, that's off the table, before James Dyson released the first vacuum. So I'll give you a second to drop your guesses into the chat. So Richard's gone with 50, great, 100. 115 from Bron, a few truckloads, yep, 1,000, 90, some really good guesses there. So it was this many, 5,127. Now, that is a remarkable number of prototypes for a founder to develop before they release a product. Now, what's most interesting to me about this is that we're talking about small incremental shifts that actually improve off the back of feedback. And I guess the provocation that I want to throw to us as educators is, where do we provide opportunities, scaffolded opportunities for young people to engage in multiple rounds of feedback in order to fuel their progress? As an English teacher, the protocol was quite typically you would hand in one draft to get teacher feedback, and then you would actually fix up what the teacher said and then hand in a final. So in the case of most English assessments for most students, it was one single draft and then you would hand in the final. But the challenge for this is, for most of our young people, we're only tapping into one opportunity for feedback, and it's only from one single source. The second element that I find fascinating is, if we look at the difference between our high achievers and perhaps some of our strugglers in education, our high achieving students rarely have to take on a significant amount of feedback in that drafting space. For the most part, they kind of get their draft and might have a few marks or iterations on it, but most of what they've done is reinforced in readiness for the final hand-in. Comparatively, some of our struggling students obviously receive an inordinate amount of feedback to process. In fact, sometimes it can be overwhelming for our young people to process the amount of feedback that they have in order to fuel moving forward. So in many cases, we see a significant disparity between the amount of feedback that we provide in order to fuel, depending on the level of capability or capacity that our young people have. What's fascinating is, when I told the story earlier about this English unit of work that we first ran entrepreneurial pedagogy in, we did this across 4 classes to test. So it was 100 students in this first cohort that we ran, and 2 classes were, for want of a better way to describe it, gifted and talented classes, and 2 classes, one was mainstream, and then a second class was actually a sporting merit class. So there were a group of young people that were on scholarship at the school for various sports, often having to travel quite significantly to get to school because of where they lived, and they were on scholarship. So we had 2 gifted and talented or extension classes, one quite typically mainstream class, and then we also had a 4th class that was a sporting merit class. Now, through this particular mode of learning, this entrepreneurial pedagogy, we saw some really interesting data come out of those 4 classes that's continued to be replicated every year with Future Anything. So now we work with about 4,500 young people across 50 schools around Australia. And interestingly, we see this same data replicate even as the scale gets greater with the number of students that we tap into. Typically, when you run an entrepreneurial pedagogy or an inquiry-based learning unit for the first time, you actually see an academic drop in your high achievers. They typically drop half a grade to a grade. And conversely, often your Struggling students, perhaps C students, or even your B- students can sometimes lift 1 to 1.5 grades by tapping into this entrepreneurial pedagogy or inquiry-based learning. Now, it's super curious, and we've taken like lots of feedback from young people to identify what the challenges are that sort of contribute to these data shifts. But most often, the reason why our academic achievers actually drop in an entrepreneurial pedagogy piece of curriculum or an inquiry-based learning classroom is that they actually don't have the adaptive mindset or the feedback fitness to process the iterative nature of a task in this model of education. They're actually quite well versed at getting a task, completing it to the verbatim of the task sheet and handing it in, and more often than not actually having that much to significantly change in that task. And so when they're faced with a unit of work, particularly around entrepreneurship, where the very nature of the program is that they need to be constantly getting feedback and then using that to fuel the next iteration, they find that process almost combative and confrontational because they're not used to having to take on feedback and actually adapt their work. Conversely, young people who are perhaps a B or a C student are quite often used to having to take feedback on. The ability to bring their own personal experiences into an environment like this actually creates like this beautiful catalyst for learning that sees them leapfrog ahead in their academic achievement. So this is super interesting when we talk about adaptive mindset in particular, is actually looking at how we set up our feedback processes to support young people to see feedback and difficult conversations about performance is actually fuel for improvement. And in this way, like success or failure are the meaning making that we create out of the feedback that we receive in combination with a fixed mindset on the outcome. So what we expect that outcome to look like. Now, there's one way for us to do this in the way that we set up our units, and that's actually to kind of preface the learning journey of curriculum over the final product. In this way, how are we actually collecting evidence across the learning journey of a unit of work, as opposed to doing sort of 8 weeks of theory and then having a 2-week assessment cycle where they actually produce a task that's handed in. And there's a few different ways that we can do this, but one in particular that I love to show is like the notion of a pivot map. And in this way, imagine if like the final task that a young person handed in was actually a map of all of their key decision making and the feedback that they received across a journey. If we use like Activate or our entrepreneurship program as one indicator for this, you might see the student start at the beginning of the journey and choose a problem that they want to tackle, which is perhaps the environment. But perhaps the first, I guess, learning pit that they encounter is the fact that they don't know much about this environmental problem. So it's the wrong problem for them to solve. So they reach this first flag when they identify that actually they have a real passion for youth mental health because they've seen their friends really struggle with their mental health. And so you actually map that, even that shift in trajectory that comes off the back of looking for feedback and recognizing that change needs to be made. From here, we actually map the next step. So maybe they prototype a couple of different solutions and test one and it fails. And then they test the second one and it's successful. And so the young person is actually able to create almost this journey map of the different decision making they've made and the different pieces of work and incremental change in their project along the course of producing the task, which then becomes an artifact of that adaptive mindset. And what we talk about with our young people through our program is we actually want to see lots of pivoting in your map. If it's a straight journey, it means you've actually not sought feedback or improvement. So in actual fact, the evidence of like a task well lived is actually in seeing like lots of movement and change across that task. So that's certainly one way to do it. I guess the key element to this that we need to talk about is often where this falls down between the teacher and the student in the classroom is the fact that we save our young people instead of serving them. One of the key lessons that we need in order to develop an adaptive mindset is actually enabling young people to fail in a safe space like education in order to take that feedback and use that to fuel doing differently next time. If we rescue our young people before they fail, they actually don't learn the lesson out of that process in what didn't go well and what they should have done instead. And so one of the critical responsibilities of an educator in an inquiry-based learning environment or an entrepreneurial pedagogy space is actually to learn to step back and recognize that the role of the educator in that space is actually to wait for that moment of failure in order to provide that reflection conversation to unpack what went well, what didn't go well, what perhaps you should have done differently. Because if the young person doesn't actually make the mistake, they can't avoid the mistake next time. And in this way, we're actually looking at shifting the role of an educator. So we're looking at the educator being the motivator. We're looking at the educator being a guide. So you're accompanying the student through the learning process. And finally, we're looking at the role of the educator as the facilitator. So you're providing access to the knowledge, but students are actually given the autonomy to construct their own learning. I feel really passionate about this one in particular, around this adaptive mindset and the work that we do in this particular skill building, because we're building a generation of young people that are leaving school without the sense of autonomy or capability to navigate some of these things as individuals without the support of an educator to sort of do everything for them. So one of these key responsibilities we have in looking at this process is actually how we can create opportunities for young people to fail and succeed in a safe environment, and then provide the reflection post that moment to actually unpack what went well and what didn't. But the key is actually in learning to kind of step back in those moments. So we've kind of tapped into adaptive mindset. I'd love to throw to some questions now. So we've looked at that one in particular. What would you like to sort of, in this last 15 minutes, what sort of questions do you have around sort of this entrepreneurial pedagogy? I know, feel free to pop your video on if you'd like to sort of ask the question, or if you're feeling shy today, or or it's just been a long day of teaching with a mask on and you'd rather not show your face, you're welcome to sort of throw those questions down the bottom. I will tap back to some of the questions we had earlier. So Stephen or Stefan, I'm not sure what the pronunciation is, I apologize. Your sort of provocation around developing that K-12 scope across the whole school, there's a couple of key steps in this. The first thing that I would say, it's actually a mapping exercise to begin with. So some of the work that we do with school leadership teams is actually sitting down with the unit overviews, 7 to 12 across every subject, and actually mapping the problem-solving opportunities that young people have, and in which context do those problem-solving opportunities exist in. And if I show a particular slide here, thinking about the context complexity that our problem-solving space operates in. So one of the key I guess, learning pits that we can hit when we sort of start to build that entrepreneurial thinking throughout our school is that our young people have the same experience across multiple curriculum areas, across multiple years, and that replication of context actually creates disengagement for young people because they see this entrepreneur thing as something that they've done before. And so one of the critical ways that we can do this is actually through variety in context, and also making the context that our young people are solving from appropriate to the complexity that they can cope with. So you'll see this sort of table in front of you. A lot of the time when our schools tap into any sort of entrepreneurial pedagogy, the first context that they apply to is sort of an international or a global context. So we ask young people to solve any problem in the world, and they'll often gravitate towards solving poverty and world hunger and all sorts of problems that exist in contexts that are actually removed from their personal experience. The key thing that we need to understand is that the best problems are solved when we're able to catalyze lived experiences with personal interests and passions. If we're asking young people to solve in a context that's removed from their own personal experience, we're actually not creating a layer of authenticity in that problem-solving space. And what we get is a generation of heropreneurs, which are often white saviors walking into developing countries, trying to fix problems that they often know nothing about. And so one of the core components of any entrepreneurial pedagogy is actually having young people to go back to, who are you? What is your lived experiences? And what problems are close to you or people that you care about? And then asking young people to solve from this space. The closer the young person is to the problem, the deeper their ability to empathize with the users for the solution will be, and therefore the more effective their solution will be as well. So the simplest context for young people to solve from is actually like problems that affect them, or problems that affect perhaps their friends and their family. So you might start with perhaps your upper primary or your lower secondary. The context that your young people might solve from will be something that affects you or somebody that affects somebody close to you. And then keeping that problem context small actually allows your young people to stay close to the solutions that they're looking for. And then they're actually more effectively able to test those solutions. From here, we can actually look at sort of building that context into a space that's larger. So looking at school or community and club. In this way, there's still communities that the young people are connected to, but we're thinking about problems that affect people at scale. So that sort of adds to the context complexity that young people are solving from. From here, we can go to national interest and then certainly to international or global concerns. The caveat to looking at global concerns is where we have our young people that have come from diverse backgrounds. They have a degree of authenticity to solve for international context because perhaps their friends or family or their own experience connects to those places and spaces. So that's kind of the caveat to that. And the most complex context for young people to solve from is that future hypothetical. So a context that hasn't occurred yet. But when we're looking at that K to 12 development of this entrepreneurial pedagogy, the first thing we need to do is map the context and the product. So what problem context are young people solving from, and what is the product that they're intended to create or the outcome at the end of it? And then we actually can find ways to create points of difference. And what we want to do is actually vortex up those skills. So the context complexity gets greater as the young people move through that schooling. And then also the products that they're producing through that journey are also more complex as well. If young people are producing a pitch about a global issue in year 7, and then in year 8, they have to produce a pitch about a global issue again, then obviously that repetition is going to create disengagement. So thinking about the context complexity, and then secondly, thinking about the product that young people are creating and how we can vortex up those things. I guess the other thing that I want to say is that context complexity is not necessarily related to age or year level of the students. If you've got young people that have tapped into this entrepreneurial pedagogy or these inquiry-based learning opportunities from an early age in primary school, then you'll find that they'll be quite adept to navigate more complex contexts, even in an upper primary school space. However, we've all had those year 11 or year 12 classes that have never tapped into any sort of alternative pedagogy that has sort of a questioning or a problem solving space. And so if you dip them into an open-ended question, they can find that very overwhelming. So you've actually got to think about like your individual learners, not necessarily based on age, but more by stage in readiness for this sort of context. Feel free to drop other questions down there as well. We've got sort of about 10 minutes left. So thinking about effective ways to integrate entrepreneurial pedagogy into a variety of subjects. So, I mean, next year for our work that we'll be doing, we'll have 10 different curriculum streams for Activate. And I guess the best piece of advice that I can give is trying to find curriculum blocks that provide a provocation for problem solving. So one of the new units that we're developing is actually for PE, physical education. And the task that the students will have is actually to design a piece of technology that either increases participation or performance in sport. So the product that they'll be creating is kind of like a wireframing prototype or a physical prototype for some piece of technology that improves performance or improves participation in sport. So again, we're using sort of that context of engagement in sport as the problem provocation to explore something further. We're also looking at sort of sustainable development goals as a platform for problem solving. With our science context, we obviously use tectonic plates and ecosystems. I've seen some fantastic units designed around like healthy eating, even in a home ec or a food technology space. So I would be looking at, if you're looking at your piece of year-long curriculum, your unit overview, I would be trying to find which curriculum block has the closest connection to a real-world context and can be used as a problem provocation to solve from. And then we're basically just asking people for the first part of the unit to explore the problem in depth. And then from there, start to look at existing solutions. That's a key part of this entrepreneurial pedagogy, is actually having young people look at what's already solving this problem and who's already trying to solve this problem. And then from there, it moves through that design thinking process in order to come up with solutions that are unique and different and solve the problem in new and effective ways from there. Oh, okay, other examples of products. It is always a pitch, isn't it? So we've seen like lots of different products. So definitely pitch is a common one. Different versions of prototyping is something that we can explore. So some of the schools that we're working with at the moment are using like Minecraft and Roblox for students to actually build their prototypes. And so their presentation or their showcase actually becomes a showcase of the Minecraft world that they've created of their design. So I would be thinking about what are different ways to prototype. We can obviously look at wireframing, 3D printing, any form of solution. I think the presentation element is quite critical because it is one of the core skills that our young people will need moving forward. And I think if I could see a show of hands, like raise your hand if your young people are becoming harder to get to present. Like their fear of presenting is becoming so great that it makes it difficult to get them to share back to the class sometimes. Because often as we're working with schools, this is something that our educators are mentioning a lot. So whilst I would say that the end product, yeah, the end product definitely doesn't have to be the pitch, I do think that there's a place for showcase of learning in a presentation style because it asks young people to practice that communication skill. And I think that we have a responsibility as educators to create these critical opportunities for young people to practice this when it's not connected to the assessment. So we only get better at stuff when there's no risk attached to it. In fact, if we can create fast, fun, and frequent practice, that's how we build skills. So when we're thinking about creativity and innovation and thinking divergently, so ideation, for example, or we're thinking about presentation skills, what we need to do is create micro moments of practice within our classrooms, not attached to assessment. And so this becomes exercises of, okay, if the problem is like if we're looking at climate change, maybe groups go back and they research one solution that's tackling climate change at the moment, and they've got to come back and then elevator pitch that. So trying to find like really critical ways to sort of present that back in informal ways. So I totally hear you around like flatting it. Like I think sometimes it's about the environment that we create in the classroom, and it's also attaching fun to sort of these places. But I think we have a responsibility to stretch our young people in this skill space. And some of the work that we do with young people, a lot of if you jump on our website and have a look at our national finalists, a lot of the young people that are pitching in our finals are young people that historically refuse to present in class. So I think there are ways that we can reshape that presentation experience for young people, but I think that we've got to detach the practice from the assessment. That's the critical way of building up the muscle. If the only time we practice these key skills like collaborating, if the only time we practice ideating or brainstorming, if the only time we practice presenting, if the only opportunities we have to do these skills are when it's attached to an assessment task in front of the whole class, then the pressure lifts and it makes it much harder for young people to practice that safely. So the things that we need to change in that space is making it fun and completely removed from the assessment task. And it's also changing the number of people that we're pitching to. So it could be pitching back a concept in small groups of 5. And then suddenly you increase it where pairs are pitching back to 2 other teams. Or then you might be splitting the class in half where you're not necessarily watching either pitch and students are pitching back to half their peers. But it's actually looking for scaffolded opportunities to increase the pressure, I guess, for young people in spaces that are detached from the assessment task in order to build those skill levels. I know that doesn't completely fix the problem, but I would be looking at the first 5 minutes and the last 5 minutes of your lessons, and I would be picking some of those key future capabilities, and then I would be looking at ways to actually sort of practice those skills detached from the curriculum or the assessment that you're looking at as well. We've got probably about 2 or 3 minutes left. Are there any other sort of key questions to sort of jump in that I can sort of hopefully fire off and answer really quickly? Mary Lou, I think you raised like a really great question about external partnerships and the value of that. And, you know, if I could speak to that for one moment, I would say that a lot of the time we do what we do because at some point we encountered an adult who kind of told their story and shifted our perception around who we are and where we might like to go. I think there's incredible importance for educators to create safe spaces for authentic voices. And those authentic voices can come from all sorts of places. When we think about entrepreneurship or entrepreneurial pedagogy, I would be looking at alumni of your school. And so are there opportunities to invite back past students to share their stories around like business success or businesses that they've tried? I would be looking at your parent and caregiver community. One of the first sort of units that I ever taught, I just put a letter out to all of the parents in my class and just said, hey, we're doing sort of a unit around entrepreneurship. Is anybody connected to entrepreneurship or enterprise thinking at all? And I had an email back from a parent of the class who said, oh, look, you know, a friend of mine wrote a book about entrepreneurs. Would you like me to make that connection for you? Which I said, yeah, that'd be great. And then when I was introduced to that connection, it ended up being Jan Owen, who at the time was the CEO of the Foundation for Young Australians, and it is a huge powerhouse in the future of workspace and education. And so she's gone on to be a massive advocate and a personal mentor in the program. But that came from basically just sort of letting my students know and their parents what the unit was that we were studying, and then ask for that parent community to sort of jump in and back. So I would also think about how you can tap into the community at the school, because in a school of say 1,000 students, there's potentially 800 families that might know somebody a degree away of separation that can kind of add value back. So I think I would look at, when we look at external partnerships in education, I would look at how are they adding value to the experience for the educator and for the student. For me as a teacher, the reason why I stepped out of the classroom to run a company as a provider to schools was that as a classroom teacher, I realized that I rarely had the time to develop really engaging resources. I didn't have the ecosystem connections to bring in the authentic voices. And when I got to the end of an entrepreneurial program, my young people were asked to park their ideas because we had another unit of work to tap into. And so my wondering was, could I create a program or be a provider that could solve those problems for teachers? That I could do the capacity building so they felt confident in the classroom. I could do the curriculum building so that they could actually focus on teaching and learning in the classroom. And we could provide a post-program competition for young people so that those young people who were super excited about their enterprise ideas had somewhere to go with them to access the mentoring and the support and the funding that they needed to launch, without relying on educators who were already so strung out for time. So when you're looking at external providers to add value to your school, I would just be looking at what value can they add, and can they alleviate pressure for you as for the education team, and then also increase engagement for the young people. And I think if those opportunities exist, then I think there's great value in tapping into external providers. I just want to finish off by, I guess, showing perhaps like where you can go for a little bit more advice or feedback. If you haven't done so already, I know quite a few people in this room are already a part of this group, but we run like a Teachers of Entrepreneurship Facebook group, and sort of every day or every 2 days, we pop up cool, fast activities that you can run in your classroom that build some of those core capabilities for your students. They might be articles or videos or activities that you can run as lesson starters or enders. So feel free to jump in there and check out a bunch of different activities that might be able to sort of contribute to your classroom. And then our next live learning session will be on Tuesday, the 7th of September, and we're jumping into learning design in a global pandemic. So we'll actually be looking at hybrid learning and remote learning and sort of setting students up for success in what we know is a very rapidly changing and shifting education space at the moment. At a moment's notice, we could all be out of our classrooms. So if that's of interest to you, we'd love to have you join again. Conscious of time, if there's any final questions that anybody wants to drop in, welcome to sort of answer those questions in overtime. Feel free to pop your cameras on, and I'm happy to sort of answer those questions now. But I hope that that's given some, I guess, context to this notion of entrepreneurial pedagogy in a really short period of time. But feel free to reach out if there's any other way that we can support you and also support your young people in the classroom as well. And for our teachers that are remote learning, our thoughts are with you. And for our educators in a number of states now that are teaching with masks on, we know that the challenges are increasing for our teachers in the classroom. So again, if we can make life and teaching a little bit lighter, please do reach out. We'd love to support. So thanks for your time and your engagement. And stay tuned for an email, and we'll send this video out to you so that you can sort of tap into this as a resource later. Cheers.